Hello, Namaskar, and welcome to this conversation. मेरा नाम राधा गोपालन है, and I'm one of the editors of iwonder. Before we get into the conversation with Thejaswi, I'd like to just say a few words about iwonder. I think many of you are aware, iwonder is a science magazine for middle and high school teachers. It features writings about the many dimensions of teaching and learning of science, both within the classroom and outside. एंड आई वंडर जो है अंग्रेजी, हिंदी और कन्नड़ में साल में 2 बार हम पब्लिश करते हैं. सो इफ यू आर अ प्रैक्टिसिंग साइंस टीचर and and if you'd like to write for us, we really do invite you to write. And to do this, please send your ideas in 100 words to iwonder@apu.edu.in. So साथियों, आप में से जो भी प्रैक्टिसिंग टीचर्स हैं, अगर आप लिखना चाहें तो प्लीज iwonder को आप लिख दीजिएगा एंड iwonder@apu.edu.in में एक ईमेल भेज दीजिएगा. आपके आइडियाज जो हैं 100 वर्ड्स के अंदर आप लिख के भेज दीजिएगा, प्लीज. थैंक यू. एंड इफ you'd like to receive updates of each webinar and also a free print version of each issue, do subscribe to us, and you can do that by following the link that is displayed in the description of this video. You can also catch us at Facebook. तो हम Facebook पे भी हैं, तो आप हमारे साथ that is हमारा मुलाकात जो है वो Facebook पे भी हो सकता है. Now, to enhance our engagement with our readers, so what we do is we invite authors of an article in iwonder for a live discussion on the second Wednesday of every month. And today we are on one such conversation, and this time with Thejaswi Shivanand. So Thejaswi actually wrote an article on SARS-CoV-2 and the incredible tale of the dying monkey in our October 2020 special issue on the pandemic. तो शायद आप में से बहुत लोगों ने पढ़ा भी होगा ये आर्टिकल. Now Thejaswi जो है, he's a teacher at the Center for Learning. It's a school in Bangalore, and there he has taught biology for 13 years. He taught statistics as well as geography for several years, and is also very closely involved with the school library and also their nature education programs. So Tejaswi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Radha.
And before we start, so मैंने सोचा कि प्रोग्राम जो है हमारा 1 घंटे का है, ये जो डिस्कशन है उसका एक फॉर्मेट जो हमने तय किया है उसके बारे में मैं थोड़ा आपको बता दूंगी, ठीक है. So the format is actually a 1-hour discussion where in the first 30 minutes, Thejaswi and I will explore the article a little deeper so that we can get his insights on, into the work. And to all of you who have joined us today, please do put in your questions in the chat box so that, after the first 30 minutes, when we've sort of finished our conversation, we can then draw your questions into the conversation. And however, even before that, if wherever the questions are suitable, we will pull your questions into this conversation. And in the second 30 minutes, we will primarily focus on the questions that come from all of you. And then we will get some insights from and responses from Thejaswi. So thank you all very much for being here today. And let's dive in, Teju. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's start. Okay. First, I think it'll be interesting for all our participants to understand how and why, right? You decided to explore this question of where does the SARS-CoV-2 virus come from and the whole phenomenon of zoonosis. How did you think about exploring it through the story of the Kaisar-Nur forest disease? Why not directly just talk about SARS-CoV-2?
Yeah.
Or
zoonosis for that matter. So actually there's a when I was thinking of writing about the virus, the COVID virus, as we know it, COVID-19 virus. That was the time when information about the virus was scarce, and there was a lot of talk on where it came from, and people started talking about the China virus, the Wuhan virus. There was a lot of, it came from a lab, So there was a
Right.
rumor mongering, and there was, that was the situation. And I thought perhaps I should address it because there was already evidence coming to the public forum that the virus was of animal origin, that it jumped, that it came into the human population from an animal source. So since I had known that, and since there was many of us in this with the right science background had known that, I thought that's one thing that I need to talk about. That needs to be communicated, and perhaps that's an opportunity to understand the wider, phenomenon of so many viruses that have jumped in the last 30, 40 years, and it has become more common in the recent past. And then, although zoonosis have always been part of human history, it's been more common in the recent past. And why is that happening? So I thought perhaps I could bring these two together and try to understand the origins of the disease. So that was one reason why I thought of looking at zoonosis and that aspect of it.
Right.
But why the story? So the
Yeah.
story, so I mean, there maybe you can think of it in through 2, 3 different ways. One is I've always found with children
Yeah.
telling, talking about science through a good story, through a good
Yes.
story rooted in science is it has
That's
always
right.
worked better. So I mean, when I mean storytelling
Right.
through science, it's not just telling a nice story where there is some science has some marginal role. Science plays a central role over here. So it is telling the story of science or story of discoveries associated with some scientific phenomenon, but there is also a narrative as aspect to it. So that's what I mean when I'm saying I use the story of or when you said the story of the Casnur forest disease. So, and the third reason why this particular story, this story is because, I mean, I was thinking, there are so many stories right from our backyard where diseases have moved from wild populations to human populations. And this is a particularly well documented case which is not well known. If you come to parts of southern India, you may have heard of this story, you may have. Many people haven't, even from here. But it's quite well documented how people went about studying it, understanding this phenomenon, where it came from, what is the virus. From the time when the first people falling sick, were reported in 1957 to the first reports of the virus that came out in the 1960s, and then the understanding of the phenomenon, the detailed approach that went into drawing out where it came from, what were its animal origins, all this took its own time, right? So this entire process is great. It was a great story. So I had to tell it in the form of a story. So, I mean, that's Radha, I don't think I can hear you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? I
Yes,
think it
right,
went to
right,
mute.
right.
Yeah.
Yes,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah.
So the thing is, I was just wondering that, this approach, and as you point out, it is the storytelling is so powerful, right?
Yes,
But
exactly.
also from and from the point of view of science learning, particularly.
Yep.
And what I really found very interesting, particularly for teachers, I think, the point that you made, that it has to be embedded in a story from which you pull out, from the history of science, and which has all of
Exactly.
the facts and also illustrations and examples that you can use to explain various
Exactly.
phenomena in science, right?
That's right.
So
That's right. Exactly.
yeah, so now I was just thinking that, if we were to sort of continue in the same vein,
Yeah.
many of these catastrophic events, whether it's natural disasters or whether it's pandemics, quite often the focus is, of course, on addressing the consequences of it, right? Like, we
Yeah.
all, particularly now, everybody's writing about how do you address the consequences, whether it's treatment or preventive measures. But
Yeah.
your article talks about the cause, right?
Yeah.
It
That's right.
examines the root cause of the event
Yeah.
and also the ecology of the virus, right?
Yeah.
So, have you used this approach in, looking at other ecological issues with your students, human-animal interaction or conflicts, etc.? So what's
Yeah.
been your experience? I think it would be interesting to hear
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, there are many stories where which when one can draw from in this case. In whenever we talk of ecology, again the main examples that people I think you can think of several examples where, like the tiger, for example, the story of the tiger. If you take the
Right.
story of the tiger, it's usually the story of say poaching that you would have heard of, or maybe the
That's right.
occasional killing that happens on the fringes that you would have read in newspapers. But
Right.
actually, the story of the tiger is a long story that stretches back in time.
Right.
That
Right.
goes into stories of hunting. I
Right.
mean, you have heard of hunting in colonial times, where
Right.
uh, maybe dozens of tigers over a short
Right.
period of time were shot for sport. And
Right.
again, this is something that people today, children today, wouldn't have known of unless
Right.
they go to some kind of an old colonial bungalow or
Right.
somebody with a colonial past, and they
Right.
see a skin, or in a
Right.
museum, and they say, where did this come
Right.
from? So
Correct.
there are great stories behind objects over there, to draw from, and to talk about the past, to bring in history, and to say, okay, you know what, this human animal interaction that we are talking about in terms of a conflict today has
Ah,
its roots stretching back quite some time. And even
okay.
back, in fact, if you go back into even further back in time, you can look
Yeah.
at painting scenes from, say, Mughal miniatures,
Yeah.
where
Yeah. Yeah.
hunting scenes were depicted. So
Yeah.
that scene is capturing something that actually happened, or something
Yes.
that is kind of an abstraction of what happened at that
That's
time.
right. That's
So,
right.
so
That's right.
some of these scenes are very powerful in telling us,
Mm.
okay, there's been a long history to the tigers, the way people interacted with the tiger.
Okay.
Of course, there's Jim Corbett, and there's
Right.
so this is
Right.
one instance of what kind of storytelling can do in talking about how an animal's interaction with human beings has changed over a period of time. Of course, there's
Right.
also mythology, there's folklore that
Correct.
adds to the richness of a cultural
Okay.
experience of the tiger.
Okay.
But
Okay.
for
Okay.
me, how
Yeah.
understanding that history is not
Yes.
simply through these images of paintings and so on, but it can
Correct.
also be done through DNA,
That's right. Okay. Very
right?
interesting point.
So now
Very
that is
interesting.
that is the additional scientific element, storytelling, that comes in, right? So I say, okay,
Okay.
how do I know what happened in the past, right? So
Okay.
suppose you go to that same museum skin, take a small snip of it, okay,
Okay.
and you can
Okay.
actually extract DNA from it, and
Correct.
you can
Correct.
tell, you can extract information from the DNA that tells you, okay, this, and you can identify that individual tiger. Perhaps you
Correct.
can
Correct.
get a sense of what the tiger population was like from that information,
Mm.
from the DNA
Mm.
information. And then you can take a more recent sample, a blood sample from a living tiger, or
Mm.
even
Mm.
DNA extracted from tiger scat, tiger
Mm.
poop.
Mm. Mm.
And then you
Mm.
compare, okay, look at the DNA today, because the
Mm.
DNA is coming from the tiger population today. Look at the
Mm.
DNA from the past and
Mm.
see what has
Mm.
happened.
Mm.
What With
Mm.
this information, you can actually trace
Mm.
the population decline in the tigers, and
Mm.
that gives you kind of, if
Mm.
you
Oh, interesting.
overlay that with the
Mm.
information that you have from historical sources, you can actually correlate the two stories, that the decline happened, and I
Okay.
can show that using scientific data as well. So
Right.
it's a great story.
Yeah, and
Again,
also the other interesting thing that you pointed out now is also you're sort of not looking at it as discrete events, you know, you're sort
no,
of giving us a
exactly.
very sort of, it gives the student or the learner or whoever it is, and even you and I as teachers,
Yeah, exactly.
we'll begin to look at connections, relationships, and a kind of a systemic view of something, you know, as a,
Exactly.
right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's something
exactly.
so
Very much.
important from an ecological. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
So there, here, now we are looking at habitat, climate change, habitat. Now
Yes,
again, you're looking at climate change and future. Now this is what
yes,
happened in the past. Forests were lost over a period of
correct.
time. So habitats have shrunk. Now habitat shrinkage continues to happen, where we take up space for power plants, for
Right,
various reasons,
right.
industries, coal mines. But in addition to that, you have climates changing in the same environments where
That's right. That's
these
right.
habitat shrinkage is happening now. So what is the impact on, I mean, not just the tiger, but everyone else who's living there?
Yeah. Yeah. And then coming to zoonosis, right? I mean, like you
Yeah,
you draw the connection of And in your article, particularly where you talk about I thought the significance from a teaching point of view, one of the interesting things I found is how the ecology, the ecology element is brought to something that is seen primarily in terms of a disease, the the causing organism and the effect and the prevention and the treatment, as
Yeah,
opposed to I mean, not as opposed to, in addition to the fact that now there's this other whole dimension, right? I mean, if we look at it from an ecological, from a more systemic perspective,
yeah,
then one can look at different ways of preventing it, right? I
yeah,
mean,
very much, very much.
so that I found. And another, so actually, since you were talking about history and the tiger and the DNA, I thought, we should really touch upon this aspect of evolution, which you talk a little
Yeah,
bit about as well.
yeah,
You say that, in your article, there was this one line that I really, and I'm going to read the exact line. It said, neither did the virus know, nor was it designed for humans, right? All that happened was the virus combined the features it already possessed as an infectious agent in another animal with an opportunity to infect a human being.
right,
Now,
that's right.
it would be great if you elaborated on what is this virus not knowing. And the reason
Yeah,
I'm asking this question is, as teachers, and I'm sure you've come across this, and many of our
yeah,
participants must have, is children many times, or even as adults ourselves, we attribute intent and purpose to, say, for
that's right.
example, a virus in this case, right?
Yes, exactly.
So, why is the virus mutating? It's
Yeah,
because it wants to infect. There's this
yes,
whole other thing.
exactly. That's
So,
right.
if you could sort of elaborate a little bit on why you wrote that
Yeah.
sentence of the virus did
So
not know.
yeah, yeah. So the virus truly did not know, because in some sense the virus, like, the other kind of discussion that's often there when we talk of viruses is that the viruses are are they living or non-living and so on.
Right,
But
right,
when once you are in the host, the virus is very much a dividing and proliferating particle, right? There are multiple
right.
particles that occupy space and so on, but the virus does not know, but the virus has the information in the DNA,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm,
the information in the DNA that is in the form of mutations, right?
mm-hmm,
When a virus replicates inside the host, it changes, it
mm-hmm.
accumulates
Right,
new mutations. Now, the virus does not have to know to mutate. It is a part of the
right,
natural process, the way DNA replicates, that
right,
mutations accumulate. The only distinction I'd like to make is that the virus is more prone to mutations, that there are
right,
greater numbers
right.
of mutations that happen inside the virus.
That's right.
And
That's right.
at the same time, then see, because the generation time of the virus is much quicker than the human generation time, right? So you
Correct,
keep seeing in the virus, just in a matter of days, there are multiple generations that have happened,
correct,
which
correct.
means that within your body at any given point in time, there are multiple strain. I mean, I wouldn't call them strains, so multiple viruses variants that are
Yes.
circulating, which are
Okay,
slightly different from each other.
okay, okay,
So, but at the same time, when I cough, for example, if I have COVID and I cough, some of these strains, some of these different variants go out, right?
okay,
So there'll be more than one variant that is going out of my mouth when I'm coughing.
okay.
But only a few of these variants reach another person. The
Mm-hmm,
ones that are
mm-hmm.
most effective in reaching the other person and increasing in numbers in the other person, causing disease them will increase in numbers. The other
Right,
variants will just go away.
right,
They're
right,
just
right,
they don't reach the other person, and some of the others will be removed by my own immune system. So
right,
all the variants that originate in me because I have the disease will not necessarily reach and cause disease elsewhere. Some of them do.
right,
And the
right,
ones that they do are better placed to do it than the ones that miss out. So they
right,
have the right mutations to move across. So they don't
right,
have to know. That's how it is.
right,
The
right,
process of generating mutations and generating these variants
right,
gives the mutations are what are giving the property for the virus to
right,
transmit better, transmit more
right,
effectively,
right.
reproduce more, with greater
Ability.
efficiency,
Right,
and therefore cause disease in another individual.
right.
And then when it spreads through a population, right?
Yeah,
When
yeah,
that particular variant increases in number in a population, that's when you start seeing, oh, there's an England variant, there's a South
yeah,
Africa mutation, there's a
yeah.
Brazil mutation. That's what you keep hearing. That
Correct.
started somewhere in some individual,
Right.
perhaps in Brazil, perhaps in South Africa, I don't know. But currently, the numbers of that particular variant have
Mhm.
increased in those areas, and
Mhm.
it's a population phenomenon. So there you
Right.
see the virus
Yeah.
doesn't have to know. It doesn't
Yeah.
have intention. It doesn't have
Yeah.
a nervous system. But mutations give its power, and the fact that it reproduces and increases in number, and the fact that 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 just that property allows it to that particular variant to increase in frequency at the cost of other variants means that it's just
Yeah.
doing better. So
So
therefore,
therefore, so as a
as a
teacher, that's very
yeah,
interesting. No, I mean what you say, because as a teacher, then when you're teaching something like, say, evolution,
yes,
particularly when you're teaching something like evolution,
exactly,
to sort of get students, or to be able to understand, there are a number of drivers of the evolutionary process, and that
exactly,
evolution happens at a population. When we talk
exactly.
about evolution, we're talking about it at a
At
population.
at the level of a population, yes,
Right.
that's
So,
right.
in from a teaching point of view, I find that when you have, particularly this kind of a paragraph, it's provocative enough for a teacher. Say, if I was to take your article,
Yeah,
and I'm just thinking that, if I was to take your article and use it as a resource to teach in a class, right? I mean, so
yeah,
there would be many things that one would actually pick from it
yeah.
to sort of teach. And at this point, no, I think we have a question actually, Teju.
Already, okay.
From, yeah, nice, yeah, from
Yeah,
Spruti. Says, Spurti, I think, yeah, Spurti
okay.
says, does the virus mutate inside the host organism?
Yeah. So yes, it does. So that's where it replicates and reproduces, right? So that's when the viral DNA, when a virus enters a host cell, it replicates inside the cell using the host machinery. And at that time, during replication, mutations occur as part of the DNA replication process itself, and therefore the mutations originate within the host and
Hmm.
then get transmitted to another host, an
Okay.
uninfected host, or maybe an infected one also. You can reinfect
Mhm.
as well.
Reinfect as well. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah. So that's an interesting one, because I think it's also this. There is so this issue of, when do, say, we're talking about viruses, so microorganisms per se, given, as you pointed
yeah,
out, their short generation cycles.
yeah.
That the process can take place because of exposure to various conditions, right? I mean, it is,
That's right.
say, for example, exposure to physical forces, to chemical, I mean, to physical
Yeah,
process, to chemical
yeah,
process,
yeah, yeah.
to biological processes,
That's right.
and then there is a change in the genetic structure, and then which
That's right.
manifests itself then as.
Yeah,
And of
yeah.
course, we also know, I mean, this thing, I think you also refer to it, and there are other articles in that issue which also refer to this whole issue of, RNA
Mutations.
viruses
Yeah,
and their predilection to mutations.
that's right.
That
Yeah,
there is that reference as well. So yeah. So then, so I was thinking, okay, so now since we're sitting on the virus question here, there was another point in the article that, where you talked about, particularly in the context of the Kyasanur forest
yes, no
disease,
fast. Yeah.
Cashman's forest disease. You said that, that you talk about two interesting patterns, right?
Hmm.
Linking the area, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and the people infected. So I thought this was quite an
Yes,
interesting question to come in at this
yes,
point.
yes.
So there are two patterns. One is which links the area and the people infected.
Right.
So if one is trying to understand the science of, natural phenomena, what do you think the role is in recognizing these kind of patterns and rhythms? What do you think? I mean, do you think it helps us understand the principles of the phenomenon, the underlying mechanisms, etc., etc.?
Yeah.
And I want to add on a question to this, and I want to get your experience. Is that,
Okay.
how does this kind of constantly looking for this, say, patterns and rhythms, how does it also rejuvenate the teacher, because you're sort of
Yeah.
teaching the same concept, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
now I'll leave it
Exactly.
to you. Yeah, so I'll leave it to you to
Yeah.
batch
Yeah.
after batch, right? Yeah.
Yes, of course. Batch after batch for years together. No, you're right that say in this case, when I looked at this story and I read about it and I heard, I mean, I knew about this story for many years, and there was a in class, I had a context where I had to bring it up, and I did discuss it. So when you look at epidemiological studies like this, right, looking at people and where people live, and what happened at the time, and when they moved in closer to the forest, and there were more incursions, as in the people started going at greater frequency. It was not that
Into the
people
forest.
did not live in these areas, but there were
Correct.
new settlers. So
Huh. Huh.
these were not Adivasi that we are talking about. Many of the people who came in settled in the 40s and 50s and so on.
Mm.
And once they started moving into the forest with greater frequency, taking their cattle over there for feed and so on, they started encountering um, monkeys, dead
Huh.
monkeys
Huh.
with fleas on them. And these are people who
Huh.
did not know how to what
Huh.
to do with that. It was a
Huh.
new. They would go close to the monkeys, and the
Huh.
fleas that were there would jump.
Huh.
Sorry,
Huh.
the
Huh.
ticks that were on the
Six were
monkeys
there.
would
Huh.
jump. So the
Huh.
ticks, some of the ticks which were, I mean, of course, ticks don't feed on dead animals, and the
Huh.
unfed ticks that were on the monkeys jumped onto the people, and of course, people were bitten, and the virus that was there in the viral in the tick,
Yeah.
entered human blood and so on. So understanding that, what did it allow me to do? It allowed me to kind of uh, uh, reimagine, understand this whole cycle, this transmission cycle, which is true of so many diseases. I
Right.
knew that this is the same for, say, another disease, say,
Correct.
whether it was if plague, for example, where
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
different organism, malaria, it's a
Malaria.
different
Right.
organism. So, I mean, you teach the malarial life cycle, you know everything about it, and it's part of the syllabus. It's wonderful that you can teach it. But at the same time, when you talk of transmission cycles, there are so many
Hmm.
wonderful examples like this one, which you can
Hmm.
bring. I mean, you research as a teacher, or for you to
Hmm.
research, go out,
Hmm.
research, find out, discover
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
their biology being the subject that it is, that there are
Hmm.
the diversity of life is so huge
Hmm.
that you
Hmm.
can draw examples and teach the same ideas
Hmm.
of for example, here, epidemiology, transmission cycles, the same
Hmm.
topics can be revisited by new examples. So
Hmm.
for me, when I was teaching this, for example,
Hmm.
I over a period of time, my teaching evolved.
Hmm.
Did not tend to look at this in isolation. I
Hmm.
tried to look at the transmission cycle as part of a whole, as a larger
Right.
aspect of looking at life in different ways.
Correct.
For example, let's say, from the transmission cycle, I can look at what happens once the pathogen enters the body. It enters
Right.
the blood vascular system, right? And in the
Correct.
blood vascular, I can use that as an opportunity to open up a discussion not just of the pathogen, but also of the blood vascular system,
That's right. That's right.
right?
That's right.
So
That's right.
now I know that it's interconnected, but in my
Right.
syllabus, it is the blood vascular system is separate,
Separate.
transmission cycle is diseases and some chapter. So I
Correct.
don't look at a way of marrying these two together, because
Correct.
as far as the textbook goes, they are two separate
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
So
That's very true. That's very true.
what I have tried to approach is try to see, okay, if we can look at wherever possible
Yeah.
to give ideas as wholes, the
Yeah.
world as a whole, right?
Right.
So
Right.
because pedagogically, the disservice that we do, I feel, to the subject and to children is to use the textbook and the divisions of the textbook or of the syllabus as pedagogical structures.
Okay.
So I
Okay.
say, okay, the textbook has chapter A, B, C, D, and let me
Right.
follow that,
Right.
right? But the
Right.
problem is that life is never like that, and you leave it to the children then to put it together.
Correct.
Right? Now,
Correct.
often we are not able to navigate the world so easily because of this. The teacher uses the textbook as the go-to classroom tool.
Hmm.
But I mean, I feel it's very flawed. I feel textbook is a source of information. That's wonderful.
Hmm.
You are
Hmm.
the one who's interacting in the classroom to make sense of that information in a larger context. So find your examples,
Hmm.
find your bigger
So
examples. You can,
very
of course,
interesting. Yeah. No, no. I think it's a powerful point you make here because there is a rhythm, there is a pattern, right?
yeah,
Of natural phenomena or even
yeah,
phenomena like say this particular disease, the
yeah,
principles, the mechanism of this disease. There is a pattern. There is a way it happens,
yeah,
but we keep that so we can pull out millions of examples to teach
Yeah.
the same, the same principle, the same. So it
Exactly.
keeps you as a teacher very fresh and rejuvenated also.
Very
And you
much
say,
so.
so then you say,
Very much
okay,
so.
I have to teach disease, I have to teach
Yeah.
transmission, I have to teach
Yeah.
microorganisms.
Exactly.
I have to teach
Microscopy.
microscopy, and I have to teach microorganism friend or foe, which is a chapter in
Yeah.
the 7th or 8th standard textbook.
Exactly.
But I can take different examples every time, and
Yeah.
I will not compromise on, meaning I will not, but I will also, it's also a question as a teacher to be working with students to see. So, see, this is the underlying pattern to sort of
That's right.
show to them. This is the underlying pattern. Now,
Yeah.
let's apply this to other diseases and see whether this understanding can be applied to other diseases
Yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
exactly.
I mean,
So
slowly.
suppose I take the KFD
Yeah.
as the anchor. Okay,
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
hold a whole year's introductory biology course with just the Cassino forest disease or some well-known disease,
Fascinating.
say the influenza epidemic of 1918. I used that
Yeah.
actually did that
Yeah.
in
I was
class.
going to ask you to
Oh,
share that example.
a
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
year of coursework. So
Okay.
talking about introductory things like cell structure, cell function, basic biochemistry, cell division, all of this can be done. DNA, RNA, because the influenza is a lung disease, so I can talk about gas exchange system, blood vascular system, how the disease spreads, immunity. My God, I mean,
That's
leaving
right.
out plant system, but generally talking about animal physiology and basic cellular biology, physiology, it's great. So you can
Right.
have it as an anchor to,
Right.
but you think about what it needs. It needs
Yeah.
your preparation, your vision, your clarity with as far as your syllabus and the content that you
Yes.
want to cover,
Yes. Yes.
that it asks to cover, right? But
That's
at the
right.
same time, you are using it as an opportunity to explore a new way of bringing a wholeness to understanding a biological system. Or
That's
no,
right.
I mean, often
Right.
I mean, we, as far as science is concerned, our approach to investigate today is also quite reductionist. That is, we break it up into smaller pieces to and do experiments and go quite, into
In
fine
detail.
detail.
Right.
but
Right.
but the ability to zoom out and have a big picture by helping connecting pictures, making the
Right.
jigsaw work, that is, I feel that's my job as a teacher,
Correct.
to help
Correct. Correct. Correct.
children
Correct.
put
Correct.
it together.
Correct. Yeah.
And that is where, like, the 1918 example was a great example for me as a teacher
Mm.
when I tried
Mm.
it many years ago. And
Mm.
I felt there what it did to me, along
Mm.
with what it
As a
did to the
teacher.
children.
Yeah.
Say it helped me really relook at my course content. It helped me
Right.
kind of really get interested in
That's right.
looking at the same content in a different way. For
That's right.
example, I
Yeah.
looked at slides
Mm.
of images of slides of lung tissue from 1918, slides that were
Okay.
made there and photographed of the lung
Yeah.
tissue, and compared them to, say, images of lung tissue today under the
Today.
microscope. So we
Correct.
had a
Correct.
discussion of microscopy, of staining. How did the
Correct.
children just ask questions? How did the staining? How did they stain? What did they use? How did it last 100 years?
Right.
No,
Right.
and
Right. Right. Right.
so
Right.
you
Right.
could go into so many different angles.
Correct.
And why did people die within 3 days of getting that virus? Right.
That's
Look
right.
at the
That's
lung tissue and what it
correct.
kind of looked like as opposed to a normal person,
Correct.
a person who died
Correct.
of natural causes without,
Correct.
and
Correct.
what the lung looked at in autopsy in that case. So
Right.
it allowed me a new opening.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
I needed to know the syllabus and the content that I needed to cover. I needed to be very familiar with that. I needed to do a lot of preparation with this topic, and I had to make all the linkages between the two,
Correct.
so that I
So
knew
here,
what I needed to
yeah.
cover. But I also needed,
Right.
it needs a lot of preparation. It needs
Right.
thinking, but it really gave me a lot of energy to relook and revisit the same content all over
That's right.
again. The same story
And
for the Casnur forest disease. It
right. And
allowed
this
me
is where
to,
I have a question from a teacher's point of view also is that,
okay,
like say for example, accessing information, right? I mean, for a
yeah,
lot of teachers, the transaction of
yeah,
the syllabus is very crucial, right? I mean,
very, yeah, exactly,
they
very
have to
much,
do it, right?
yeah,
And it's a part of our jobs. So the
yeah,
two aspects to this. One is, of course, the time and the effort that goes into
yeah,
preparing
yeah,
it.
yeah.
It's a lot of time and effort, but
It
the
does,
other,
it does.
and that's fine, and that's one aspect of it. But the
That's the
other
nature.
aspect is also accessing. information, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like say, for example, if I want to access multiple examples, of course, today accessing examples is much easier. But then the
yeah,
question, how do we look for resources?
yeah,
Where does
yeah,
one
yeah.
access example? But I take the point that you're
Let's just
making. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
just,
go ahead.
but I'll just respond to taking
Yeah,
this example. So
yeah,
if I had to
yeah,
research the Castor forest disease, for example,
yeah, yeah.
what are the sources did I use? You can look at the
Yes,
article, and in the end, I have listed some of the sources,
correct,
right?
correct.
And I typically, I mean, in that particular case, I listed internet sources so that it's easier for all of you to access as well.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
so the simplest thing, the first thing you do is do a Google search,
Right,
right? But
right.
of course, here you do need to have to put in some thought on how to do a good Google search.
Correct,
Because
correct.
the internet is like a bottomless, fathomless.
Yeah,
It doesn't know what you want. It's just there's a lot of information,
correct,
so you need to read and sieve through it. But
correct.
there it will help for you to be clear on what you are searching for. So
Ah,
that clarity that you
mm,
bring, if you just type influenza or you just type disease, it's not going to help. So
that's true.
so if you have a plan on, okay, I want to cover these aspects and I want to use a disease. Suppose that's my idea.
Correct,
Okay,
correct,
i'll
correct.
i'll see how I can kind of combine the two, and then I
Ah,
do an effective
okay,
search. I need to
okay.
I need to get better at making at searching, doing Google searches. And
That's right.
there, and then I need to, because I'm a science teacher, I need to verify the sources that
That's right.
I can't just go to Wikipedia and say, okay, this is given in Wikipedia.
That's
Is
true.
the information in Wikipedia backed up by a credible source?
Mm,
I need
mm.
to go and look up at the source. If it is a scientific paper, let me try and see if I can understand it, or I'll try to get the help of someone who can read,
Right.
who is more proficient in reading scientific papers, and help
That's
me through it.
correct.
So
Correct.
use credible sources, right?
That's right.
So
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, these are
That's
beginnings
true.
of,
These are beginning. No, no, absolutely. And I think very, very important point that you made is that there are lots of yes, easily accessible sources which we can
yeah,
start with. Because
very
even
much,
very
yeah,
simple information can be pulled into the classroom, and children can be asked to read the newspaper and bring in information.
exactly,
I mean,
very
that can,
much. Yeah,
yeah.
you can
By the
give
way, there's
children tasks
a
of that kind.
comment for you from Shiv Pandey.
Okay.
And actually, before that, from Sunil Sa, it's not a
Hmm.
question. He says, "Hi, Tejaswi sir, namaskar. It's wonderful to hear you after a long time. I remember our interaction when you met in Pondicherry in
Oh,
2018. So
okay,
that's
okay.
great. Yeah, that's a great to hear." And then Shiv Pandey has a very interesting comment too. He says, "Ki storytelling as a teaching strategy in biology could be used in the classroom to present difficult concepts, right, to
Very
students
much, yeah,
in a meaningful manner." But many
yeah,
such stories may have teleological approach, which is what we were just talking about. Shiv,
exactly.
we were just talking about this issue of teleological approach and how you have to be very wary, right?
Very,
And
very, yes, exactly.
yeah,
So
you have
there, I think when storytelling, since they're typically tend to kind of anthropomorphize, tend to use language that is, again, to explain to a a general audience. If you are using language that you use typically in stories, that I, you, say for example, intention, ascribing
mm,
intention. That was the example that
mm,
we're doing. Clearly,
correct.
that doesn't work. When you're talking of a story in science, it needs to be rooted in science. So you cannot
Mm,
have, like Mr. Pandey said, it is
mm,
very useful, but
mm,
that trap needs to be avoided, and that
mm,
trap can be avoided from you achieving clarity when you're saying, okay, if I'm telling a story, I can use a narrative, I can use a it is not storytelling in the conventional sense. It
mm,
has to be rooted in the science. So when I
mm,
say, talk about, say, the 1918 flu example again, which I gave,
mm,
I used a lot of stories from that time, right?
mm,
But
mm,
each of my stories, like say for example, I started off with the story of how people in a remote community in Alaska, Inuit
mm,
community,
mm,
died by the scores. Okay.
mm,
and
mm,
they were buried, and since
mm,
their bodies were like, we don't have too many tissue samples from that time, since their
Correct.
body were in excellent condition,
Oh,
they were
yeah.
exhumed at some point in time, and tissue samples were taken from there, right? So the starting point of that remoteness and so on is wonderful way to begin saying how did the virus reach there, talking about
Correct,
the
correct,
virus's
correct.
journey. It's not that the virus walked over there, or
Correct,
there
correct,
was
correct, correct.
somebody who was infected who reached that remote
That's
community.
right.
And why
That's
did
right.
that happen? There's a lot of history to that. That's a
Correct,
great
correct.
beginning. But finally, what is important, I am talking about the fact that an infected individual took the virus to that place, and it's only when
Yeah.
that person reached there that the virus transmission could happen, because that person coughed, and it was in the
Yeah.
immediate environment, and people who were uninfected
Right.
inhaled it, and it reproduced and so on. And then I used the same story to see how the conditions were
Yeah.
excellent for preservation, and therefore it could be a source of great information when I took the lung tissue from there, made sections, and could get it many years later when you
That's
see.
right.
So that showed how the virus was
Correct.
global, and it caused very, very similar symptoms even in remote communities. So I'm using here a story which I'm very, very carefully seeing which part of storytelling is useful and which
Very
part
good.
I'm
Yes.
rooting in science. So there,
Correct.
I think you're right. We have to
Yeah.
avoid.
Yeah. In fact, I think Shiv sort of, follows it up also. He says that even though a teleological approach may explain a concept, it may lead to a misconception, exactly what you were
Exactly,
saying.
exactly
And in
what I try to clarify.
biology, we find many exceptions to telling a concept through a story may be difficult. It's true. But like
Yeah,
Teju, you pointed out, I think, Shiv, the important thing is the work that the teacher puts in to use the story as a vehicle to literally be a hook for students, because as
yeah,
a student I'm listening to the story, but the teacher is very clear that the science is, and its
is
scientific
important. Yeah,
facts, its reasoning, all that
yeah.
embedded. That's very,
And
very
here,
good.
for example, if I tell the story of influenza, not all,
Yeah.
so that does not mean that all respiratory diseases have the same.
Correct, correct,
Yeah, so
correct.
like say for example, the transmission of SARS-CoV-2 and the influenza virus may have a similar route in terms of, say,
True,
aerosols and
true, true,
the
true.
virus spreading through air through droplets. But then once the virus goes inside, the entry point in
Yeah,
the host is different,
exactly,
right? The
exactly.
protein that is used by the SARS-CoV-2 virus is different,
Yes.
and the
Yes.
protein surface protein used by the influenza virus is different. So
True.
I need to be clear as a teacher that that's the case. So once the story isn't complete just by saying ha ye to hai. So
सही
when
बात
I'm
है.
talking about these details, I need to be very clear. So using the story is useful as long as I'm clear of the limits of using that story. To
That's
what
right.
extent can I use it, and where do I need to switch from the narrative to
To the
fact,
science,
to
to fact.
understanding, to. But I must tell this, that
Yeah,
there are different ways of using stories. Say,
correct.
for example, the other example that I often do, like when I teach 11th and 12th grade students
Yeah.
molecular biology, I teach it entirely through experiments that were done from the 1940s, pre molecular
Huh,
biology, genetics
huh,
experiments that led to
huh,
1953, the
huh.
discovery of DNA and
DNA.
understanding genetics. Some of these experiments are now gaining popularity in textbooks, but you can talk of everything to experiments.
Yeah,
DNA
yeah,
replication, so boring. There's so much detail.
yeah,
Children will, there'll be 6, 7, 8 enzymes that they'll need to mug up.
yeah. That's right.
I've
No,
done it.
absolutely.
I've done it through telling
We've
the
all done
discovery
it
of
through
how
school.
each,
Correct,
yeah,
correct,
just mug.
correct.
I've done the story of, so you don't have to go into all experiments, but one or two experiments, key experiments,
Right.
great history, great stories.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Describing, and those experiments today are actually quite accessible in terms of describing the method and so on. So
Correct.
anyway, there are
That's,
multiple
yeah,
places where you can build in
that's
stories,
right.
but I agree with you that you need to be, very, very wary of
How you
teleology and
use, yeah,
how
no,
the pitfalls of,
absolutely. I
yeah,
think
very much.
very good caution, absolutely, from Shiv. Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you.
for that. And in fact, before we, yeah, so we've got a couple of others. One is from Spurti again. Spurti
Okay.
says that, is there any evidence for virus mutation to occur outside the host, but not in laboratory condition?
See, so so let's just say the virus replicates inside cells. Okay.
Right,
Suppose
right.
you the virus is expelled from the body and it floats around. right?
Yes.
And it enters another system, say like dogs or cats, right? I don't know what's happening there. We
Right.
haven't studied. We don't have enough evidence whether the virus replicates inside a cat system or a dog system. And therefore, once it begins to replicate, it's very likely to accumulate mutations. Any replicating virus will accumulate mutations. I don't know. So if you're saying body, if you mean human body, I don't have any evidence right now.
That's
But
right.
once
That's
the
right.
virus is just floating around in
That's right.
air,
That's right. That's
it cannot. We don't have any evidence to date of free living viruses of this kind, RNA viruses, for example, which replicate outside a host system. So if there is no replication, there is no mutation. You may be thinking, okay, the virus is floating around, it's exposed to UV radiation. Will it
UV
accumulate
radiation.
mutation in between and then it enters? It's possible. Say in the short, fleeting moment where the viral particle is floating for 2 hours in the room, and a ray of whatever UV comes and hits it, and there is some transition that happens from one thing to one base to other. It's possible, but that's not the primary way in which viruses accumulate mutations, right? That's not
Yeah.
the primary way in which the
Right.
primary
Right.
way in which virus mutations happen is inside the host through
Yeah.
replication mechanisms, and
Presence
and
of a host is absolutely
yeah, is
important.
essential. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's
Yeah.
right.
In fact, Anuradha Gandhi, had another question, which is, does a vaccine work if the virus goes on mutating inside the host organism? This is the question a lot of people are trying to work on
Right,
at the
right,
moment
right,
because of the
right.
variants that we have.
Yes.
But it's also a function. I mean, it's largely a function of. And Anuradha, actually, there's so much of this information that is currently in the research phase, and currently also, of course, it's there in popular media, a lot of it. But there is so much of it
Hmm.
that's still under research, isn't it? What the
Yeah, but
virus,
also
what's
we need to let's
yeah,
yeah, but
yeah,
let's try and understand how this works,
yeah,
right? So
right,
many vaccines
yeah,
tend to produce an immune response uh,
yes,
which is wide ranging,
right.
right?
That's right.
So you have
Yes,
much a wide. So you if you let's just take the one of the viruses, why one of the vaccines
vaccines.
that is given in two stages. Why do they give it in two stages, right?
Right,
So you give
right.
the first dose of vaccine, the immune response is such that for the what is contained in the vaccine
Yes,
contains uh, um, a
it could
trigger
happen.
for the immune
Yes,
system, right?
that's right.
And there could be different kinds of triggers depending on the
That's right.
nature of the vaccine.
That's
So
right.
now the first level of immune response is a much more wide ranging. That is, it is in response to. So the way the immune response happens is that there is an initial wide-ranging response, and you want to narrow it down to be more specific to a narrower range of
This
variants that are there. So you have your second dose that narrows the response, but also strengthens the memory that is generated because of the
I'm the
response.
first one.
So you have, for what I would suggest you do is to go and look up a process under how the immune system works called clonal
That's right.
selection,
That's right.
and I think this is covered in some
One
article.
of the articles, yes, actually,
Does
yes.
cover.
Yes,
So that would
Anuradha,
be
in fact,
useful for you.
yeah, in fact, thank you for pointing that out, Tejasvi. Because Anuradha, in this pandemic special issue, there are about 3 or 4 articles. In fact, there are 2 articles by Dr. Satyajit Rat purely on immunity itself, and really sort of breaks down immunity, the mechanisms and the process of immunity, literally,
Right, right.
very, very
In much detail
great
and very
clarity.
simple, very
Great,
accessibly. Yeah.
yeah.
So I
And in
think
fact,
those would help
also
you.
those would help. And also, there's an article on, when we talk about vaccinations, again, to sort of look at what do these vaccines really mean? What are these vaccines targeting? Because you have different kinds of vaccines that are being put out there. So, Anuradha, it would be useful. I think you'd find it quite useful to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And then Amrita Ray has a comment. She's basically really sort of saying it's great to hear your scientific perspectives. They're so clear. So
So I'll tell you
that's
one thing. So the any clarity that I may have is because of because I've spent some time reading, thinking.
yeah,
Look,
that's
I
right.
don't simply depend on a textbook to give me information, and
That's right.
the textbook gives me information, but it doesn't give me perspective.
That's
It
right.
is
That's right.
important for us to think, reflect, discuss.
That's
And there
right.
is,
Yeah. And
if once you
discuss.
have discuss without discuss,
I
so
mean,
one great way of achieving clarity is to have a group of people with you, with whom you can discuss and clarify
mm,
your ideas. And for all
mm,
of us teachers, we need to create these communities
mm,
of discussion, communities of practice, where we share
mm,
ideas, where we
mm.
share our what we think. I know I have difficulty understanding this concept. I don't know what clonal selection mean. How do I know? The
Correct.
internet might tell you something. There may be a lesson plan given by somebody somewhere, but that's sometimes not enough. So
Yeah.
I
That's
suppose
right.
Radha and I get together and we discuss. I approach Radha and said, "Look, I'm really struggling with this. Can you help me?"
Yeah.
Radha may
Yeah.
have a way. She may have done something,
Correct.
and
Correct.
might share that idea with me. So
Yeah.
please find your
Yeah.
community, create your community, and that will be
Very
great for you
important.
to achieve, better ways forward. Maybe find more strategies,
That's right. That's
like
right.
maybe for your class, for some challenge that you're facing in your class. And it
True.
also does a great deal of help for in terms of clarity of thinking
Absolutely.
about,
And like you said,
yeah,
when you ask me a question, then I might think, oh, I never thought about it like that. So since you
exactly,
asked me the
exactly,
question, I might go out and do some research on that.
exactly.
Related to that was one thing, when you were just saying about questions and a community of practice, I was thinking there's another very interesting, and I really liked this particular one where it said, putting together pieces of puzzles to understand diseases, when you described epidemiology. So, and then you also follow this up by saying testing hypothesis, how to go about it. It's like being a
Yeah,
detective a little, right?
very much. Yeah,
So,
so much fun.
yeah. So I was just wondering if, this detective approach that you would have definitely used with your
Yeah,
students,
yeah, yeah.
if there is, some experience, on that would be nice. But before that, Sunil Sa actually, compliments you on the article more, and he's going to communicate with you by email. So I think that'll
Okay,
that'll be something to look forward to. But yeah,
okay,
let's come back to this thing about detective work. How do
okay,
we as teachers use this detective approach with students? I think that would
okay.
be interesting.
so,
Yeah.
so I mean, there are two, three things that you can do. So there are when you say detective, rather I take it in different ways. So one
Yes.
detective approach that I use is to uh, throw clues to children. So what I
Yes.
mean by throwing clues is
Yes.
like
Yes.
offering a tantalizing glimpse or an example, and
Yes.
then posing a question.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
when I
Yeah.
pose a question, like say
Yeah.
for example, if I what I show if I kind of read a situation, like I read a excerpt of a First World War, say army barracks.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
and I described what it was like. This is actual description from a letter, okay, that a
Mm-hmm.
soldier wrote. And that particular letter had how animals were living in close proximity
Mm-hmm.
to human beings, right? There were
Mm, mm,
pigs.
mm,
now
mm.
now I said this is the situation, okay,
Right.
and then they have all kinds of other information also available to them. Now they have to make the connection.
That's right.
The
That's right.
connection is that where the virus could have come potentially, where is the breeding,
Ah,
where are the opportunities for
okay.
the virus to jump.
Okay.
So
Okay.
now
Interesting.
giving that particular example really allows you to kind of ask a question. So throw that
That's right.
example and ask a question. Now
Okay.
I
Okay.
can give many examples of this kind where I can throw examples and ask questions.
That's
So
right. That's
so it could be a string of examples where you can
right.
lead to
Mm,
create the transmission
mm.
cycle.
Ah,
It
that's right. That's
Yeah,
true.
I can break it down
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
break down a transmission cycle
True.
to a series of clues and get them to construct it,
Yes. Yes. No,
right?
that's superb. Actually, yes. Very true.
So
Very,
that
very
is
true.
one example. So the other
Okay.
example of detective work, and this is very hardcore science, this is detective work in its true sense. I used to do
Huh.
this as, okay, I had the time and the luxury actually to do it
Yeah.
because I was not constrained by a textbook. So I had two
Correct.
years to teach my 12th grade curriculum, and I used to take 1 month off, sometimes a month and a half, 5, 6 to 7 weeks, and ask children to design their own experiment. They had to look around, look at look at some phenomenon that they wanted to investigate, think of an approach, think of a question, right? Think of a hypothesis, think of an experiment, think of controls, standardize it, do the experiment, think of a protocol, standardize the protocol, perform it many times, and then tell me what happens. So there, that is also, that is in a way, that is detective work in the traditional what we do in science, right? So giving opportunities for children to experience experimentation and not simply proof of principle, what we do typically, right? So that is another, that is detective work in a different way. But that is about what we do in science. So how do children get an opportunity to actually do scientific detective work? Like, how do you pick up clues? How do you ask questions? What are good questions to ask in a particular context? How do you follow discussions as this happens?
What you just said, I was thinking, for supposing if we were to look even at 7th, 8th standard level, okay, 7th, 8th, middle school, high school.
Very
so
much,
then, because then you can actually, even if you do take them out on nature walks or actually ask them to set up their own experiments, these are, even for that age group, right? I mean, it doesn't.
So take something, I'll just give you one example. So setting up some simple experiments. Now you see butterflies come and, you see on a sunny afternoon, butterflies are, can be seen on wet patches. It's an observation, right? Now, question is, why does that happen?
Why? Right.
I mean, many a child has asked that. Now, how do you investigate that?
That's right.
Right? How do you create an experiment that can be used to investigate that? What can you investigate as far as that is concerned? So you can do a very, very simple, experiment, right? So I mean, I'm not going to. So this is homework for all of you who are part of this. Think of it. I don't want to give you an easy answer. No, what is that experiment? How do you involve children? Think about it. Think of creative ways of that phenomenon of butterflies mud puddling, and how would you investigate that with children?
That's right.
What kind of experiments would you do? How do you help them, structure a discussion that would generate a question? How do you help structure a discussion that would lead them to a direction of investigation, and then a means of investigation? Right? Direction,
the scientific
means,
process. The scientific process.
And it can be opened up very nicely.
And ants, no? I mean, like, children are always asking questions about ants, right? Why do they go and can
in a line?
There's a comment for you from Asif Akhtar, who says that it's so interesting when we work like detectives, he says, for scientific investigation. And he thanks us for bringing this up for our discussion.
It's always more fun.
It's always more fun. And now that you're talking about detective approaches, another thing I was thinking, because see, you've taught biology, you've taught nature education also, right?
Yeah.
And also you've taught geography, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sure many of because we always think about cutting across disciplines, right? Biology, geography, etc.
Yeah.
So, and also EVS, of course. So I'm sure many of the teachers here, it's like, okay, so this article that we have, that you've written for iwonder, pulling it out and using it for different situations, different
so for example, I know you're in different contexts, right? In different subjects. For example, if you want to look at geography, you can look at, I mean, many. So again, we have different ideas of what geography is, right? One conventional geography. You can look at disease maps, how pandemics spread over time. Where did it start? Where did it go after that? Use that as a great way to explore the continents and explore the world.
Right.
So, on what routes did it take? Say, for example, the plague, the cholera. Cholera was not there in the West. Cholera was a disease of the Indian subcontinent. How did it reach different parts of Europe and America? Right? It's great. I mean, shipping was the route that went. Who took it to those countries? Sailors. How did that happen? So understanding that, using that to understand, using mapping, shipping routes to understand transmission. You can beautifully reimagine the world in a very different way using that.
That's right.
It is epidemiology, and it is maps. It is looking at the world, right? And we can look at, I mean, again, if you look at ecology, now we are looking at EVS, right? When you're looking at see, come on, all this is about is EVS. It's not biology
Yeah,
or
it's
whatever.
not
You
exact.
just change the focus slightly and it becomes EVS. If you
Yeah,
want to use it in EVS
yeah.
context, the same story can be part of
Same
it.
story can be used,
So
exactly.
yeah, I mean, you can talk of,
No, no,
say,
I
for
think you're
example,
absolutely right. Also,
who.
in your article, I
So
was just thinking social
one
science,
second,
right?
dear.
Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry,
So
go
one
ahead.
can, I'll just say. So for example, one you can use it in very young with very young children, like the home of the tick. Where is the home? So when you talk of
Oh,
home, you talk of our home being of a settlement where houses are
ah,
located, and we go to the to a forest, which is
ah,
truly not our homes. I mean, not
correct,
Adivasis do live, but I'm
correct.
talking of us, people who are not from Adivasi
Mhm.
communities. We go from a settlement and we go into the forest, right? It's not our home in
Mm.
that sense, but it's
Mm.
home to the monkey, right?
Hmm.
But what
Hmm.
about where is the tick located here? Where is the home of the tick? Right? The tick is present on the monkey, but it's also present on other large animals. So the tick has several homes. When the tick isn't feeding, it's also found on plants. So that's also a home. So you
Ah,
can open up. I mean, it's the ideas are endless.
yeah.
You can just use the same idea to,
You're right. No, no,
I mean, you just need to
social
use your
science.
imagination a little bit.
Correct. Yeah. And I was thinking that, I'm sorry, I got so excited, but that social science bit, I was just thinking, no, I mean, like in sixth standard, I know there's this thing about what is home, So
Yeah,
this
yeah,
could be, no, but it's just wonderful. I mean, this could just open up. So Shiv actually comes back again to our conversation, says that he found storytelling as a teaching strategies similar in some extent with traditional lecture method. As in this method, also students are able to learn new facts from stories without prior exposure. That's very, very
yeah.
true, Shiv. I
Very
think
true.
it's an
Very true. Very true. So
very true.
I think it's the power of the narrative.
Yes,
That is what
exactly.
is you need to leverage that, but at the same
Exactly.
time we need to remember that
Yeah,
the power of the narrative can take you that far, but when we are talking science, it has to be rooted in science.
rooted in science.
So we
Very true.
cannot forget that when we are it's not like a say,
Yeah,
suppose you are a storyteller and you say you want
yeah,
to bring in science through storytelling. If you do
yeah.
not root it in science, then it becomes a nice story and you're going to lose the
Right.
science,
That is
right?
true.
So the whole,
Very.
so what's your purpose? If as a storyteller you want to tell a good story, then tell a good story. If it
Yeah,
has elements of science, that's great, you tell a good
yeah.
story. But in a classroom, if you want to use storytelling to communicate ideas, to communicate concepts, to open up science thinking in science, do it with
That's
that
right.
clarity that you will return to the science, and that
That's
you
no
do
very
not forget
important
it
point.
in with the
Yeah.
the getting just carried away by the story itself.
Story itself. Teju, you really re-emphasize a point which we'd had in another webinar with Rohini Chinta on storytelling in science, because she uses storytelling very effectively. But this point came up repeatedly even there, that what's important is that it's a vehicle, but we mustn't
Yeah,
forget that really it is the.
very much.
And Kavita
It's the science.
Keshari is thanking you very much for your suggestions, especially the detective approach of problems. I'm hoping that many people are going to go back and make detectives out
But
of their students.
yeah, but I must warn you, you need to be, all of this requires
Yeah.
preparation. You cannot
Yes.
walk into a
Correct.
classroom and say, I will start a detective. You cannot do that.
Absolutely.
Please prepare
Absolutely.
well. Please
Yes.
think
Very
what
true.
you want to do. If you want to
Yeah.
create your clues, create them with thought and
Yeah.
let
That's
them
very
be
true.
rooted in science,
True.
right?
But
If you
no,
want to
good
talk
point.
about transmission cycles, divide
Correct.
up the transmission cycle in a way that you are able to create clues
That's
depending
right.
on what age group that you're looking at,
Yeah.
what kind of stories do you want to use, what kind of clues do you want to use, what is detective approach for you, right?
Correct.
There's so
Correct.
many things there, even
That's true.
detectives. I mean,
Yeah.
for me, my predilection, my because of my
Yeah.
own interest in history, I often use history
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
stories from scientific discoveries,
That's right.
personalities, life
Correct.
stories, like, say, for example, the whole drama between which many of you know of, Rosalind Franklin's
Yes.
role. I
Yes.
mean,
Yes.
it's important for me to understand and to communicate to children that
Yeah.
science is not removed from society. It is
Yeah.
located in society, right? Why wasn't Franklin recognized? How did Watson get away with all his misogyny and
Correct.
continue to get away with it for many decades afterwards, right?
That's
So
right.
what does
That's
that
right.
mean? I can't remove and often I do this. I
Yeah,
talk about science in a context of
that's right.
society.
That's
that
right.
should also come. So when I say science storytelling and all that, if and in an appropriate age, I feel
Yeah.
it's very important to demonstrate science with
Yes.
context, and we
Absolutely.
often don't do
Absolutely.
justice to it, and we
Do it. Correct.
I don't know if many scientists also think
Yeah.
about science as located in the Indian context. For example, what is the influence of society, of caste,
That's right. That's
for
right.
example, on
Yeah. Yeah.
science?
Yeah.
What does
No,
it
no, it's
do to the
also science is not in a vacuum, right? I mean, that's the
it
most
isn't
important thing.
exactly, that is
It
very, very important
exists
for us
in
to
a
understand
context.
it. Yeah.
Exactly. So, Teju, it
So
looks like I think we've sort of at a point of wrapping up. I have a feeling because
okay.
we've sort of we are in our five. Actually, yeah, we're a little bit after our 5:30 mark,
Okay.
and I'm just looking to see if we have any more questions. We don't seem to have any more questions, so that's great. But otherwise, we should like if there were a few more questions, we would have just continued a little bit more. But
Yeah.
I
No,
would
that's all
like
right.
to actually thank everyone for their comments. I mean, really, thank you very much for that.
Yeah. Thank you,
So now
everyone. Thank you for your.
let me just sort of wrap up a little bit. And one thing is, of course, I cannot thank you enough, Teju, for this very exciting. It was just lovely to have this conversation, and also you sort of really drew our attention for all of us. I think I could speak for all of us of how we are such an integral part of this web of nature, and that
Yeah.
we need to
Yeah.
really look at things from that context, and also for the
Systemic as a
caution.
whole. Yeah. That's right.
Systemic, exactly, and also for the caution that your article brings about how many of our actions break can create breaks in these webs, in this web of nature.
Yeah. No, you're
And
right.
look at the
Can I
info
just say something here, Radha?
yeah, please,
Because
please, please.
I feel this going forward. I think
Yeah,
one of the other reasons I wrote this and bringing the
yeah,
focus on zoonosis is this
yeah.
fear that came up again a few months earlier. That
Yes,
newspaper article on how many more viruses are out there. Right? It
yes,
is
yes,
true that there are many
yes.
more viruses. We had
That's right.
Nipah
That's
and
right.
various others coming
That's
up
right.
recently. But
That's right.
what does it do to understand these
Yes,
stories of how it have
that's right.
come up in the
That's
past,
right.
and what do we need to be prepared for? How do we
That's
need to
very
think
true.
about
Yeah,
it? How do,
yeah,
as people, as individuals, and as governments, and as
yeah,
different,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. No, no, and also it comes right back full circle where we've said, why that you went back to the cause,
yeah,
and that is so important. And if you really understand it from that point of view, then the actions you take are so different instead of
exactly.
just treating the symptoms, which are important.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Isn't it? Yeah, yeah. And then the other issue of course, the other issue, as Vijeta points out, the other issue that came up was, can killing bats solve the problem? I mean, there were just so many myths and so many such things. But I'd like to
Yeah.
really thank you once again, and thanks to everyone for those who joined us today. Thank you very much. And if you have any additional questions, and if you've got any other thoughts that you would like to share, please do sort of send us your questions, and we'll try
I'll be
and sort
happy
of
to
get
answer as
this
well.
week. Absolutely, yeah. So do join us again for our next webinar, which is on March 10th. And, the publicity for it will come out, so you will know more details about it. And for those of you who'd like to, receive a free copy of our latest issue, don't forget to subscribe to iWonder. And once again, thank you, Teju, and thanks to all of you. This was a wonderful
Thank you, Radha.
discussion.
Thanks.
And have a great evening,
Thank
everyone.
you,
Thank you.
everybody, for
Yeah.
being here, and yeah,
Bye-bye.
I had great fun.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.